The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Alexis Morgan adjusted her position behind the Barrett M82 sniper rifle. Her breathing was steady, controlled. 3 miles away, a Taliban ambush was forming around her unit's patrol route. Through her scope, she could make out the distinctive silhouettes of fighters moving into position. They had no idea she was watching. "Overwatch, this is Echo 6, crackled the radio beside her. "We're approaching the valley entrance. Any activity?" Morgan pressed her finger to her earpiece. "Echo 6, I count 3 hostiles setting up on the ridgeline northeast of your position, 2 with AKs, 1 with an RPG. She knew what would happen if that RPG found its mark on the lead Humvee. The narrow valley would become a killing zone. "Copy that, Overwatch. Can you neutralize?" Morgan didn't respond immediately. She ran through her mental calculations one more time. Distance 450 meters. Windage approximately 8 mph from the west. Temperature 84 degrees. Elevation difference 215 meters above target. "Affirmative, Echo 6. Stand by." She inhaled deeply, then released half the air from her lungs, settling into that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats. Her finger took up the first pressure on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as she made a final micro-adjustment for wind. The rifle roared, bucking against her shoulder. Through her scope, she watched the first Taliban fighter drop before the sound of her shot had even reached the valley. Without celebration, she cycled the bolt and acquired her second target, who was now looking around in confusion. Another breath, another shot, another kill. The third target, the one with the RPG, was already running for cover. Morgan tracked him, leading his movement, slightly calculating the extra half-second it would take for the bullet to reach him at this distance. The final shot rang out across the valley. The man crumpled mid-stride. "Target's down," she reported flatly. "Valley is clear for passage." There was a brief silence on the radio, then, "Damn, Morgan, that's 3 for 3 at nearly a mile. Nice shooting." Captain Reynolds, her unit commander, had been watching through binoculars from his position a quarter-mile behind her. As she packed up her gear, he approached his expression a mixture of approval and something else, skepticism perhaps. "That was good shooting, Morgan," he said, helping her lift the heavy pack. "But don't start thinking this is normal. Nobody makes 3 consecutive kill shots at that distance without some serious luck involved." Morgan said nothing, just nodded slightly. She'd heard it all before. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, shimmered in the August heat as William Old Bull Harrison made his way across the base. At 68, with shoulders still broad despite his age, he walked with the purposeful stride of a man who'd spent 4 decades in uniform. His weathered face, lined with the marks of sun and desert wind, reflected campaigns stretching back to Desert Storm and beyond. Harrison had trained snipers for most of his career, first for the Army Special Forces, then as a civilian contractor after retirement. He'd seen thousands of shooters come through his courses. But in all those years, only a handful had possessed what he called the gift, that rare combination of physical ability, mental discipline, and instinctive understanding of ballistics that separates good shooters from the truly exceptional. Alexis Morgan had been one of those rare ones. Harrison still remembered the first time he'd seen her on the range back in '98. Just a young private, then barely 20, assigned to his basic marksmanship course. Most instructors had written her off immediately, too small-framed for the heavy rifles, too quiet to command respect. But Harrison had noticed something in her eyes when she took position behind the rifle, a stillness, a focus that couldn't be taught. On the final day of qualification, she'd outshot everyone, including several special operations candidates. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that, Private?" he'd asked her afterward. "My father taught me, Sergeant," she'd replied. He was in the first Gulf War. Said a rifle doesn't care if you're big or small, man or woman. It only cares if you respect it. Harrison had taken her under his wing after that, providing extra training, pushing her capabilities further than standard Army programs allowed. When the Pentagon had finally opened combat roles to women, Morgan had been among the first female soldiers qualified for special operations, support largely due to Harrison's advocacy. "She's got a natural talent I haven't seen in 20 years, he'd told the skeptical selection board. "Even among the best men I've trained." Now, as Harrison approached the east firing range, he spotted her immediately, the same quiet concentration, the same precise movements. But something was wrong with this picture. Staff Sergeant Alexis Morgan, with 2 combat tours and a Silver Star, wasn't behind a rifle. She was picking up spent shell casings, dumping them into a large bucket. "Morgan," he called out as he approached. "What the hell is this?" She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm. For a moment, surprise broke through her usual reserve, then a genuine smile. "Sergeant Harrison, didn't know you were on base." He gestured to the bucket. "This doesn't answer my question." Morgan's smile faded. "Medical board evaluation after my last tour. Shrapnel damage to my right shoulder. They've deemed me unfit for combat operations." Harrison's face darkened. "So they've got one of the best snipers in the Army picking up brass." "Someone has to do it," she replied with a shrug. "Bullshit," Harrison spat. "You know how many confirmed kills you had in Afghanistan?" 47, she answered quietly, "including a confirmed hit at 2 per 143 meters. Do you know how many people in the entire U.S. military have made a shot at that distance under combat conditions?" She didn't answer. "I can count them on one hand," Harrison continued. "And they've got you on cleanup duty." Morgan set the bucket down. At 34, she still looked remarkably young, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her frame lean and athletic. Only her eyes revealed the weight of what she'd seen, the cool assessment of someone who had made life-or-death decisions hundreds of times. "I don't complain, Sarge," she said. "I'm still a soldier. I go where they need me." Harrison was about to respond when Morgan's radio crackled. "Sergeant Morgan, please report to the main range immediately. VIPs incoming for the demonstration." She picked up her bucket. "Duty calls." Harrison fell into step beside her. "What demonstration?" "Some brass from the Pentagon along with foreign military observers. Supposed to be a showcase of American marksmanship." Harrison snorted. "And they've got their best marksmen picking up the brass instead of shooting. That's the Army I know and love." The motorcade of black SUVs arrived precisely at 1400 hours, kicking up dust, as they pulled alongside the main firing range. Morgan continued her work methodically collecting spent casings while keeping one eye on the proceedings. Lieutenant Colonel Michaels, the base commander, emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by a collection of officers from various branches. Morgan recognized the uniforms of several Allied nations, British, German, Israeli. But it was the last man from the second SUV who caught her attention. Tall, with close-cropped dark hair, and the physique of someone who spent hours daily in physical training, he moved with the confident ease of a predator. The trident insignia on his uniform marked him immediately Navy SEAL. The silver oak leaves on his collar, Commander. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Colonel Michaels, "welcome to Fort Bragg, home of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Today, we'll be demonstrating advanced marksmanship techniques and equipment currently employed by American Special Operations Forces." As the group moved toward the firing line, Morgan noticed Harrison watching the proceedings with narrowed eyes. "You know him?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the SEAL officer. "Commander Ryan Winters," Harrison replied, voice low. "SEAL Team 6, Supposedly has the longest confirmed kill in American military history, 450 meters in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Supposedly, Harrison's mouth tightened. Let's just say some records are more verified than others. The demonstration began with standard marksmanship displays. Army Rangers and Special Forces soldiers showcasing their skills at various distances from 300 meters out to 800. The visitors nodded appreciatively, but Morgan could see Winters was barely paying attention. His eyes kept drifting to something on the far end of the range. Morgan followed his gaze and spotted it, a single target set up on the distant mountainside, barely visible to the naked eye. Colonel Michaels was leading the group to the long-range section now. And here we have our precision shooting area, where our snipers train for extended range engagements. Impressive facility, commented one of the British officers. What's the maximum distance you train for? We regularly practice out to 1,500 meters, Michaels replied. But as you can see, we have targets set at various distances beyond that for special training scenarios. Winters spoke for the first time, his voice carrying easily across the range. And that target way out there. He pointed to the distant silhouette Morgan had noticed. What distance is that? Colonel Michaels smiled, though Morgan detected a hint of discomfort. That's our extreme long-range target, set at 285 meters. A murmur ran through the group of observers. Over 2 miles, Winters said, impressed. Has anyone actually hit it? Michaels cleared his throat. It's primarily for theoretical training purposes, understanding ballistics at extreme distances. So no one has hit it, Winters concluded. It's at the very edge of what's ballistically possible with current technology, Michaels explained. The variables at that distance, wind temperature gradients, Coriolis effect, make consistent accuracy virtually impossible. Winters smiled slightly. In my experience, Colonel, nothing is impossible. It's just a matter of skill and the right equipment. He gestured to the firing line. Perhaps a demonstration is in order. Michaels looked uncomfortable but nodded. Of course, Commander. We'd be honored. A range officer quickly approached with a rifle case. From it, he removed an M24 sniper weapon system, the Army's standard-issue sniper rifle based on the Remington 700 Action, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. Winters examined the weapon with expert hands, checking the bolt action, testing the trigger pull, examining the scope. Leopold Mark IV, nice glass, he commented, though I'm more accustomed to the TAM X8 system we use in the teams. Harrison leaned close to Morgan. TAM X8 is next-generation targeting, integrated ballistic computer, atmospheric sensors, the works. Makes this almost an unfair comparison. Morgan watched as Winters settled into position behind the rifle. His form was textbook perfect, steady grip, solid cheek weld, controlled breathing. He began with the closer targets, making short work of silhouettes at 800 meters, then 200 meters. Each shot found its mark with precision that impressed even Morgan's experienced eye. At 800 meters, Winters took more time, making subtle adjustments before each shot. 3 rounds, 3 hits. Remarkable shooting, Commander, Colonel Michaels said, genuine admiration in his voice. Winters rose to his feet, rolling his shoulders. His eyes drifted again to the distant target at 285 meters. For a moment, he seemed to consider it, then handed the rifle back to the range officer. I'd need my own equipment for anything beyond this, he said. Different rifle, different optics. That target out there, he nodded toward the distant silhouette, is probably best left as a theoretical exercise after all. The words hung in the air, carrying an unmistakable message. Even he, with his record-breaking shot in Afghanistan, wouldn't attempt such a distance with standard equipment. Morgan felt something stir inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her injury. It was the same sensation she'd had in Afghanistan when faced with impossible shots to save her team, a calm certainty. She looked down at the bucket of brass casings in her hand, then at Harrison, who was watching her with a knowing expression. "Don't do it," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Whatever you're thinking right now." She set the bucket down. "They should at least try." "Morgan." But she was already walking toward the group of officers, her stride purposeful. Colonel Michaels noticed her approach, his expression showing confusion, then alarm. "Sergeant Morgan, we're in the middle of a demonstration," he said, warning clear in his tone. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Michaels while coming to attention. "Permission to attempt the long-range target." A stunned silence fell over the group. Winters turned to look at her fully, for the first time taking in the maintenance uniform, the bucket of casings nearby. His eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, amusement evident in his voice. "Did the range maintenance staff just volunteer for precision shooting?" Several of the observers chuckled. Morgan kept her eyes fixed on Colonel Michaels, ignoring the heat rising in her cheeks. "Staff Sergeant Alexis Morgan, sir," she said formally. "2 tours in Afghanistan. 47 confirmed kills. Longest verified shot at 2,800 foot." The chuckling stopped. Winters's expression shifted from amusement to something more calculating. "I see," he said slowly. "And you think you can hit a target at 3,285 meters with equipment you haven't zeroed in conditions you haven't studied after spending the morning collecting brass?" "I'd like to try, sir." Colonel Michaels looked deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't how military demonstrations were supposed to go, particularly not in front of foreign observers. But refusing Morgan's request now would create an equally awkward situation. "Commander Winters," he said carefully, "would you have any objection?" Winters studied Morgan for a long moment. "None whatsoever, Colonel," he finally replied. "Though perhaps we should make it interesting." "Interesting, Commander?" Michaels asked. "A wager of sorts." Winters smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "If the sergeant misses, which is the statistically probable outcome, she returns to her duties without complaint. But if by some miracle she hits the target—" He paused. "Well, I suppose I'll owe her an apology." "And if she hits center mass—" Harrison's voice cut through the tension as he stepped forward. Winters' gaze shifted to Harrison, recognition flickering across his features. "Sergeant Major Harrison, I didn't realize you were still around." "Retired," Harrison corrected. "Just visiting. You didn't answer my question." Winters' smile tightened. "If she hits center mass at 3,285 meters with this rifle, I'll personally recommend her for the President's 100, though I assure you, gentlemen, that won't be necessary." Morgan nodded once. "I accept those terms, sir." As she walked toward the firing line, her heart was pounding, but her hands remained steady. Behind her, she could hear the observers repositioning for a better view, feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. Some curious, some skeptical, some openly mocking. She picked up the M24 rifle that Winters had been using minutes before. The weapon was familiar in her hands. She'd fired thousands of rounds through similar systems during her career. But as she examined it, she noted differences from her personal rifle. The scope was good, but not what she was accustomed to. The trigger pull was slightly heavier than her preference. "Problem, Staff Sergeant," Winters called from behind her. "No, sir," Morgan replied, continuing her inspection. "Just getting familiar with the weapon." In reality, her mind was racing through calculations. The distance was enormous, over 2 miles, nearly half a mile beyond her longest confirmed shot. The wind was variable, gusting from different directions at different elevations. The target was small, probably no more than 18 inches across, at a distance where a single minute of angle represented over 30 inches of variation. The odds were astronomically against her, which was exactly why Winters had agreed so readily to the attempt. Morgan knelt behind the firing line, the M24 rifle resting on its bipod in front of her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the range fade away. This was her ritual, something she'd done before every important shot during her tours in Afghanistan. In that moment of silence, she could almost forget about the watching officers, the mocking SEAL commander, and the impossible distance to the target. When she opened her eyes, the world had narrowed to just her, the rifle, and that distant speck on the mountainside. "Take your time, Staff Sergeant," said Colonel Michaels, though she could hear the nervousness in his voice. Morgan began her preparations methodically. First, she studied the wind. She could see grass and small bushes at various distances, watching how they moved. The wind near the firing line was coming from the southwest at maybe 8 but at longer distances she could see it was shifting, coming more from the west and picking up speed. "She's actually taking this seriously," she heard one of the German officers whisper. "Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into," replied another. Commander Winters stood with his arms crossed, checking his watch with obvious impatience. "Whenever you're ready, Staff Sergeant. We don't have all day." Morgan ignored him. She was calculating bullet drop wind drift and a dozen other factors that would affect her shot. The .300 Winchester Magnum round would leave the barrel at about 2,800 feet per second. But after traveling more than 2 miles, it would have slowed considerably and dropped nearly 400 feet. She adjusted the scope's elevation and windage knobs, making her best estimates based on the conditions she could observe. But she knew that at this distance even a small miscalculation would mean a complete miss. "You know," said Winters loud enough for everyone to hear, "in my experience, the most dangerous thing on a battlefield isn't the enemy. It's an overconfident soldier who doesn't know their limitations." Morgan's jaw tightened, but she continued her preparations. She checked the rifle's action, making sure it was properly seated. She examined the cartridge before loading it, looking for any defects that might affect accuracy. As she worked, memories flooded back. Afghanistan, 2009. Her spotter, Corporal Mike Johnson, had called out a target at extreme range. "I've got movement ridgeline northeast. Distance. Jesus, that's got to be over 2,800 meters. Her unit commander had asked over the radio, "Can you make the shot?" Morgan had studied the target through her scope. 1 shot. If she missed, the Taliban spotter would disappear into the rocks, and her unit would be walking into an ambush. "Sending it," she'd replied. The shot had been perfect. Later, when they'd reached the position, they'd found the enemy with a single bullet hole center mass. The rangefinder had confirmed it, 2,300. It had been the longest confirmed kill by a female sniper in military history. "Staff Sergeant," Colonel Michaels's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you ready?" Morgan settled into position behind the rifle. The stock felt familiar against her shoulder, even though she'd never fired this particular weapon before. This was the moment she'd trained for countless times, muscle memory taking over. Through the scope, the target was barely visible. At maximum magnification, it appeared as a small white square against the brown mountainside. She could see heat shimmer rising from the ground between her and the target, and she knew that would affect the bullet's path, too. "1 shot?" asked Winters. "Or would you prefer a few practice rounds to get your bearings?" "1 shot," Morgan replied, without looking up from the scope. "Confident. I respect that, even if it's misplaced." Morgan controlled her breathing, taking slow, deep breaths and letting them out gradually. Her heart rate slowed. The chatter behind her faded to a distant murmur. Everything in the world except her, the rifle and the target ceased to exist. She began to apply pressure to the trigger, not pulling it, but gradually increasing the force until the rifle would fire at the exact moment she chose. This was the most critical part. At this distance, even the slightest jerk or flinch would send the bullet far from its intended target. "Wind's picking up," observed one of the spotters. Morgan had noticed it too. She could see the grass moving differently now, the wind shifting more toward the northwest. She made a tiny adjustment to her point of aim, moving the crosshair slightly to compensate. "Any time now, Staff Sergeant," said Winters, "though I suppose there's no shame in admitting this is beyond your capabilities." The comment was designed to rattle her, to make her rush the shot or second-guess herself. Morgan had encountered this kind of psychological warfare before, both from enemies and, unfortunately, from some of her own fellow soldiers who couldn't accept that a woman might be their equal in marksmanship. Instead of responding, she began her final breathing cycle. Deep breath in, let half of it out. Hold. In that moment of perfect stillness, when her body was completely stable and her mind was focused like a laser, she applied the final pressure to the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The sound of the shot echoed off the mountains and rolled back across the range like thunder. Through the scope she watched for the target, though at this distance it would take nearly 4 seconds for the bullet to reach its destination. 4 seconds that felt like an eternity. Morgan stayed perfectly still, tracking the target through her scope. Behind her, she could hear the spotters adjusting their binoculars and telescopes, trying to see the result. "I don't see an impact," called out one of the spotters. "Check the target again," ordered Colonel Michaels. There was a long pause as the spotter with the most powerful telescope examined the distant target carefully. I think I see something," he said uncertainly. "It's hard to tell at this distance." "What do you mean you think you see something?" demanded Winters. "Either there's a hit or there isn't." "There appears to be a mark on the target, sir, but I can't tell if it's a bullet hole or just a shadow." Morgan finally lifted her head from the scope. She'd felt the shot was good when she'd taken it, but at this distance, even a perfect shot could be thrown off by a dozen factors she couldn't control. "We'll need to drive out and check the target," said Colonel Michaels. "Surely that's not necessary," protested Winters. "If the spotter can't clearly see a hit, then obviously we check the target," the colonel said firmly. "That was the agreement." The drive to the target took 20 minutes in a Humvee across rough terrain. Morgan sat in the back, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to think about what would happen if she'd missed. She'd be the laughingstock of the base. Worse, she'd have confirmed every stereotype about women in combat roles. As they approached the target, Morgan could see it was a standard military silhouette target, about 18 inches wide and 30 inches tall. It was mounted on a sturdy frame and had clearly been used for previous shooting exercises, with several bullet holes from closer ranges. The Humvee stopped about 50 meters from the target. Everyone climbed out and walked the remaining distance. Commander Winters was in the lead, clearly expecting to prove his point about American overconfidence. As they got closer, Morgan could see a fresh hole in the target. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to stay calm. A hit anywhere on the target would be impressive at this range, but she knew that Winters would find ways to diminish even that achievement. They were now close enough to see the target clearly. There, just left of center mass, was a clean bullet hole. The paper around it was only slightly torn, indicating the bullet had been traveling straight when it hit, not tumbling or destabilized. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered one of the American officers. Commander Winters examined the hole closely, clearly looking for any reason to dispute the result. But the evidence was undeniable. The hole was fresh, the right caliber, and in exactly the position where a bullet fired from their location would hit. "Impressive," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was anything but impressed. "A hit at that range is certainly noteworthy. Of course it's not center mass, but under the circumstances—" "Actually, sir," interrupted the spotter, who had been calling out ranges all day. He was holding a laser rangefinder and had been taking measurements. "Given the wind conditions and the distance that shot is almost exactly where it should be for a perfect center mass aim point. The bullet drift puts it just slightly left, which is exactly what you'd expect with the crosswind we had." Morgan allowed herself a small smile. The spotter was right. She hadn't been aiming for the left side of the target. She'd aimed for dead center and let physics do the rest. Commander Winter's expression darkened. "I see. Well, as I said, a noteworthy shot. Of course, anyone can get lucky once." "Lucky." Morgan spoke for the first time since taking the shot. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the mountain air. "Sir, with respect, luck doesn't account for wind calculation, bullet drop compensation, and atmospheric conditions. That was a calculated shot based on 20 years of experience and training." The SEAL commander turned to face her fully. 20 years. You don't look old enough to have 20 years of anything." "I started competitive shooting when I was 12, sir. Been in the Army for 14 years. 2 combat tours, 47 confirmed kills, including 6 at ranges over 1,500 meters." The numbers hung in the air like a challenge. Morgan had never bragged about her record before, but something in Winters's dismissive attitude had pushed her too far. "Well," said Colonel Michaels, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, "I think we can all agree that was an exceptional demonstration of marksmanship. Perhaps we should head back to base." But Winters wasn't finished. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, was it? I have to ask, what exactly are you doing collecting shell casings, if you're such an accomplished sniper?" The question hit like a slap. Morgan felt all eyes on her, and she knew her answer would determine how she was viewed by everyone present. "I was wounded in action, sir. Took shrapnel in my right shoulder. The Army Medical Board determined I was no longer fit for combat duties." "I see. And they assigned you to custodial work." "Someone has to do it, sir." "Indeed." Winters smiled coldly. "Though I have to wonder if the American military is making the best use of its resources. In the Navy, we find ways to utilize experienced operators, even when they can't serve on the front lines." The implication was clear. The Army was wasting Morgan's talents, treating a skilled sniper like a janitor. And the worst part was he was right. As they drove back to the main base, Morgan stared out the window at the North Carolina landscape. She'd made the shot, proved her point, and earned a grudging acknowledgement from the SEAL commander. But nothing had really changed. Tomorrow, she'd be back on the range with her bucket collecting other people's shell casings. Unless something changed first. The story of Morgan's incredible shot spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire. By evening, Chow, half the base, had heard some version of the tale. Most of the accounts were wildly exaggerated. Some claimed she'd hit a target at over 4,000 meters. Others said she'd been blindfolded. One particularly creative version had her making the shot while doing jumping jacks. But the basic facts were impressive enough. A wounded soldier assigned to range cleanup had outshot a famous SEAL sniper at an impossible distance. For a military base where respect was earned through competence, it was the kind of story that became instant legend. Morgan tried to eat her dinner in peace, but soldiers kept approaching her table to congratulate her or ask for details. She answered politely but briefly uncomfortable with the attention. She'd never been one for the spotlight. "Morgan," called out Sergeant First Class Jensen as he approached with his tray. "Mind if I sit?" Morgan gestured to the empty chair across from her. Jensen had been her immediate supervisor since she'd been assigned to range maintenance, and their relationship had been strictly professional. He was a decent enough soldier, but like many others, he'd seemed to view her assignment as proof that wounded soldiers were more trouble than they were worth. "Hell of a shot today," he said as he sat down. "I mean, hell of a shot. I've been in the Army 15 years and I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you, Sergeant." Jensen studied her face. "You know I owe you an apology. When they assigned you to my detail, I figured you were just another broken soldier they didn't know what to do with. I was wrong." Morgan looked up from her meal. This was the first time Jensen had ever spoken to her as anything other than a subordinate who needed managing. "I appreciate that, Sergeant. Question is, what happens now? You can't go back to just picking up brass after what you did today. Word is already getting up to brigade level." Before Morgan could respond, the dining hall fell unusually quiet. She looked up to see Commander Winters entering with several other officers. They collected their trays and found a table across the room, but Morgan could feel Winters' eyes on her periodically throughout their meal. "Speak of the devil," muttered Jensen. "That Navy SEAL has been asking questions about you all afternoon. Wanted to know your complete service record, your medical status, everything." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests he's not done with you yet." As if summoned by their conversation, Commander Winters stood up from his table and walked over to theirs. Jensen started to rise, but Winters waved him back down. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, might I have a word?" Morgan nodded and followed him to a quieter corner of the dining hall. Up close, she could see that his earlier condescension had been replaced by something else. Calculation, perhaps, or genuine curiosity. "That was quite a performance today," he began. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon." "It wasn't a performance, sir. It was just shooting." "Just shooting." He smiled slightly. "Do you know what the longest confirmed kill in military history is, Staff Sergeant? I believe it's held by a Canadian sniper, sir. 3,540 meters in Afghanistan. Close. It's actually 3,540 meters by a Joint Task Force 2 operative. But before that, it was my shot at 3,450 meters also in Afghanistan." Winters paused. "The point is, what you did today hitting a target at 3,285 meters, that's extraordinary by any standard." Morgan waited. She could sense this conversation was leading somewhere, but she couldn't guess where. "I've been speaking with your Colonel Michaels about your situation. It seems the Army has a talent for mismanaging its human resources." The comment stung because it was true. "I serve where I'm assigned, sir." "Of course. Very admirable." Winters glanced around the dining hall, then leaned in slightly. "The Navy SEALs are hosting an international sniper competition next month at our training facility in Utah. Teams from 12 countries, including the United States. The best military marksmen in the world, competing over 5 days in various disciplines." Morgan's pulse quickened. She'd heard of such competitions, but had never imagined participating in one. "The thing is," Winters continued, "I have some influence over the selection process. And after today's demonstration, I believe you might be exactly what the competition needs." "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "What I'm suggesting, Staff Sergeant, is that you represent the United States in this competition. Show the world what American marksmanship is really capable of." For a moment, Morgan was speechless. The opportunity he was describing was beyond anything she'd dared to hope for. But then, reality crashed back in. "Sir, I'm not sure that's possible. My medical status, my current assignment—" "Details," Winters said dismissively. "I've already spoken to Colonel Michaels. He's willing to recommend you for temporary duty if I make the formal request through proper channels." Morgan's mind raced. This could be the chance she'd been dreaming of, a way back to what she did best. A chance to prove that her injury hadn't ended her career as a soldier. But something in Winter's manner made her cautious. "Why would you do this, sir? After what happened today?" Winters's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say I believe in giving people the opportunity to prove themselves. Besides, it would be interesting to see how you perform under real pressure with the best shooters in the world watching." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a test. And Morgan had the distinct impression that Commander Winters was expecting her to fail. "I need time to think about it, sir." "Of course, but not too much time. I'll need an answer by tomorrow evening if we're going to make the arrangements." As Winters walked away, Jensen leaned over. "What was that about?" Morgan explained the offer, watching Jensen's expression shift from excitement to concern. "Morgan, that sounds incredible, but are you sure about this guy's motives? I mean, after the way he acted today?" "I'm not sure about anything, Sergeant, but when was the last time someone offered me a chance to do what I was trained for?" Dratum. That night, Morgan lay awake in her barracks room staring at the ceiling. The other soldiers in her unit were asleep, their quiet snoring a familiar background noise, but sleep wouldn't come for her. The smart thing would be to decline Winter's offer. She had a comfortable, if unrewarding, assignment. Her shoulder was healing well, and in a few months she might be able to request reassignment to a training role or administrative position that would make better use of her skills. But the shot today had reminded her of who she really was. Not a custodian or a broken soldier, but one of the finest marksmen the Army had ever produced. She thought about her father, who had taught her to shoot on their small ranch in Texas. He'd been a Green Beret in the First Gulf War, and he'd recognized her natural talent early. "Lexi," he used to say, "shooting isn't about the gun or the target. It's about knowing yourself, trusting your training, and never backing down from a challenge." Her father had died 3 years ago while she was deployed. She'd never gotten to show him her longest shots, never got to share the pride she felt when her unit commander called her the best damn sniper in the battalion. By morning, her decision was made. She found Commander Winters in the base headquarters building, reviewing maps with some American officers. When he saw her approach, he excused himself and stepped into the hallway. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, I trust you've made your decision." "Yes, sir. I accept your offer." Winters nodded slowly. "Excellent. I'll begin making the arrangements immediately." He started to turn away, then paused. "You should know, this competition isn't like what you did yesterday. 5 days of various challenges, different weather conditions, multiple distances and scenarios. The best snipers from SEAL Team 6, British SAS, German, KSK, Russian, Spetsnaz, and 8 other elite units." "I understand, sir." "Because I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself, or more importantly, embarrass the United States military." There it was again, the subtle condescension, the suggestion that she was in over her head. Morgan felt the familiar fire building in her chest. "I won't embarrass anyone, sir." "We'll see." Winters turned to go, then added, "One more thing, Staff Sergeant. This competition isn't just about marksmanship. It's about performing under pressure, adapting to unfamiliar equipment and conditions, and representing your country with dignity. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" Morgan met his gaze steadily. "I've been preparing for it my whole life, sir." Winters studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, pack your gear. We leave for Utah in 2 weeks." As Morgan walked back to her barracks, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was getting her chance, but she knew it came with enormous risk. If she failed spectacularly, it wouldn't just be her own reputation on the line. It would confirm every doubt anyone had ever had about wounded soldiers, female snipers, or American military competence. But if she succeeded, Morgan allowed herself a small smile. If she succeeded, she'd show the world exactly what Staff Sergeant Alexis Morgan was capable of. Later that afternoon, she found Sergeant Major Harrison waiting for her outside the barracks. His expression was thunderous. "You accepted Winter's offer," he said. "It wasn't a question. How did you—" Word travels fast, especially when it involves a SEAL commander pulling strings to get an Army sniper into an international competition. Morgan sighed. "It's an opportunity, Sarge. Maybe my only one." Harrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. Ryan Winters doesn't do favors without an angle. He wants you to fail Morgan. He can't stand the fact that a woman, an Army woman, at that might be a better shot than him." "Maybe that's exactly why I have to do this," Morgan replied. "Not just for me, but for every woman they've said couldn't cut it." Harrison studied her face, then his expression softened. "You're going to do this no matter what I say, aren't you?" "Yes, Sarge." He sighed heavily. "Then you'd better not embarrass me. I've been telling people for years you're the best natural shooter I've ever seen. Don't make me a liar." Morgan smiled. "I won't, Sarge." That evening, Morgan returned to her quarters and opened the small footlocker where she kept her few personal items. From it, she removed an old photograph in a simple frame. A man in desert camouflage stood beside a younger version of herself, his arm around her shoulders, both smiling at the camera. Her father had been so proud when she'd enlisted. "Following in the old man's footsteps," he'd said. But he had also warned her about the challenges she'd face as a woman in the military. "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the credit," he'd told her. "But I've never known you to back down from a challenge." Morgan traced her finger over his face in the photograph. "I won't let you down, Dad," she whispered. "Not this time." She placed the photo carefully on her nightstand where she could see it from her bunk. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the biggest challenge of her career. But tonight, she would sleep with the knowledge that she was taking the first step back toward becoming the soldier she was meant to be. The soldier her father had always believed she could be. The desert sun beat down on the shooting range, harsh and unforgiving. Alexis Morgan stood at the edge of her bunk, carefully arranging her gear. 2 weeks had passed in a blur of preparation, and now the day had arrived. She'd been granted temporary duty status and flown to the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility in the Utah desert, where the first International Special Operations Sniper Competition was set to begin the following morning. Morgan paused, examining her father's old compass. The scratched brass case held more than just a magnetized needle. It carried memories of her childhood learning to navigate the Texas backcountry. Her father, a Green Beret, who served with distinction during Desert Storm, had placed it in her hands when she was just 10 years old. "The world will try to knock you off course, Lexi," he'd told her. "Always know where true north is." A knock at her door interrupted the memory. "Come in," she called. The door swung open to reveal William Harrison, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Sarge," Morgan said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "What you think I'd miss this?" Harrison stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "The chance to see you put those SEAL boys in their place. Not for all the whiskey in Kentucky." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Should you even be here?" Your doctor said. "My doctor says a lot of things." Harrison waved dismissively, "most of which I ignore. Been doing that for 40 years. Seems to be working fine." Morgan couldn't help but smile. Despite his gruff exterior, Harrison had been the closest thing to family she'd had since her father passed. His presence here, despite his health concerns, meant more than she could express. Besides, Harrison continued, someone's got to keep an eye on Winters. That man's got an agenda, mark my words. Morgan nodded. She'd spent the past 2 weeks wondering about Winters' true motives. The SEAL commander had been conspicuously absent since their arrival, handling administrative matters according to the staff. The opening ceremony is in an hour, Harrison said. You ready for this? Morgan closed her equipment bag with deliberate precision. As ready as I'll ever be. Harrison studied her for a moment. You know, your old man would be proud as hell right now. Morgan swallowed hard, fighting the sudden tightness in her throat. I hope so, Sarge. The assembly area buzzed with activity as competitors from 12 nations gathered under the massive canopy erected to shield them from the desert sun. Morgan stood slightly apart, acutely aware that she was the only woman among the 24 elite snipers. The operators moved with the distinctive confidence of men who had spent years in the world's most dangerous places. Russian Spetsnaz, British SAS, German KSK, Israeli Sayeret Matkal, and others, each nation had sent their 2 best marksmen. The American contingent consisted of Morgan and a massive Delta Force operator named Davis, a man whose neck appeared wider than his head. Davis had barely acknowledged Morgan since their arrival, offering only a curt nod when they were first introduced. His body language spoke volumes. He didn't believe she belonged here. As Morgan scanned the crowd, she spotted Commander Winters entering with a group of senior officers. He wore his dress uniform today, ribbons and insignia gleaming in the morning light. Behind him walked a woman Morgan didn't recognize, an officer in her mid-40s with short-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone accustomed to command. "Attention!" called the Master Chief Petty Officer managing the event. "Officer on deck." The military personnel snapped to attention as Commander Winters took the podium. "At ease," he said, surveying the assembled competitors. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first International Special Operations Sniper Competition. Over the next 5 days, you will face challenges designed to test the limits of your skill, endurance, and adaptability." Winters paused, his eyes briefly meeting Morgan's before continuing. "Each day will focus on different aspects of precision shooting. Day 1 will establish baseline performance with known distance targets from 600 to 200 meters. Day 2 will test fieldcraft with unknown distance engagements and unconventional firing positions. Day 3 combines endurance and accuracy with a 20-kilometer trek through desert terrain, engaging targets along the way. Day 4 will focus on shooting under stress, time pressure, environmental factors, and physical exertion. And finally, Day 5 will culminate in the ultimate challenge: extreme long-range precision. A murmur ran through the group at this last announcement. "You represent the finest marksmen your nations have to offer," Winters continued. "But by week's end, we'll know who truly deserves that title. Good luck to you all." As the competitors began to disperse, Morgan noticed the female officer who had entered with Winters approaching her. "Staff Sergeant Morgan," she said, extending her hand. "Captain Rebecca Hayes, Pentagon Liaison and Competition Logistics Director." Morgan shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "Ma'am." "Walk with me, Sergeant," Hayes said, gesturing toward the edge of the assembly area. Once they were out of earshot of the others, Hayes's formal demeanor shifted slightly. "I wanted to meet you personally," she said, her voice lower. "Your presence here has caused quite a stir in certain circles." "I can imagine, ma'am." Hayes studied Morgan with sharp eyes. "Let me be blunt, Sergeant. Commander Winters didn't invite you here out of the goodness of his heart." Morgan tensed. "With respect, ma'am, I'm aware of that." "No, I don't think you are." Hayes glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Winters doesn't just want you to fail. He needs you to fail. There's more at stake here than a competition." Morgan frowned. I don't understand. There's a program under consideration at the Pentagon, Hayes explained. A significant expansion of combat roles for women in special operations. The success or failure of that program could hinge on performances like yours. The realization hit Morgan like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her, or even about proving Winters wrong. This was about potentially opening or closing doors for countless women who would come after her. "Why are you telling me this, ma'am?" Hayes's expression softened slightly. "Because I spent 20 years fighting the same battles you're fighting now. I was force recon before women were officially allowed in combat roles. I had to prove myself every single day." She paused, then added, "And because you should know exactly what you're up against. Winters has stacked the deck against you, Sergeant. The competition parameters, the judging criteria, even some of the equipment allocation, it's all designed to favor operators like Davis and the SEAL teams." Morgan absorbed this information silently, her resolve hardening. "Thank you for the warning, ma'am." Hayes nodded once. "I can't openly help you, Sergeant. My position requires neutrality. But," she added with the ghost of a smile, "I can ensure the playing field isn't tilted any more than it already is." As Hayes walked away, Morgan felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This competition had suddenly become about much more than personal redemption. Day 1 dawned clear and cool, a brief respite before the desert heat would assert itself. The competitors gathered at the primary firing range where targets had been set up at various distances: 600, 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters. Morgan had been assigned to Firing Station 3 alongside a stoic Russian operator, identified only as Volkov, and a chatty German named Mueller. As they prepared their equipment, Morgan couldn't help but notice the disparity in their gear. While she had been issued a standard M24 sniper rifle, the same model she'd used at Fort Bragg, most of the other competitors carried cutting-edge systems with advanced optics and custom modifications. Volkov's rifle featured an integrated ballistic computer, while Mueller's sported a scope that likely cost more than Morgan's entire setup. "First stage 600 meters, announced the range officer. "You will have 5 minutes to study conditions and prepare your equipment, followed by 3 shots for score. Begin preparation now." Morgan knelt behind her rifle, methodically checking each component. The M24 was a reliable system based on the Remington 700 action, but it lacked the refinements of the newer rifles around her. She would need to compensate with skill and experience. She studied the range conditions carefully. The wind was light, 5 mph from the northwest. Temperature was climbing already at 75 degrees. Humidity was low, typical of the desert environment. At 600 meters, these factors would have minimal impact, but she knew the later stages would be more challenging. "Time," called the range officer. "Shooters ready? Fire when ready." Morgan settled into position, her breathing slowing automatically. The routine was so familiar it felt like coming home. Inhale, exhale, halfway hold. The crosshairs settled on the center of the target. She took up the first pressure on the trigger, then squeezed smoothly. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through her scope, she watched the bullet strike the 9-ring just right of center. A good shot, but not perfect. She made a small adjustment and fired again. The second round hit the 10-ring. The third followed suit. "Good shooting," muttered Mueller beside her, peering through his spotting scope at her target. When the scores were posted after the first string, Morgan found herself in 4th place overall. Davis led the pack with a perfect score, followed closely by a British SAS operator and Volkov. The 800-meter stage proved more challenging as the wind picked up, gusting unpredictably across the range. Morgan's first shot drifted into the 8-ring, forcing her to quickly recalibrate for her follow-up shots. She recovered well, placing her next 2 rounds in the 9-ring. By the time they reached the 1,000-meter stage, the desert heat had created significant mirage effects, making the targets waver in the scope. Morgan drew on her Afghanistan experience, where dust storms and heat shimmer had often created similar challenges. Her 3-shot group at 1,000 meters was tight all hits in the 9 and 10 rings. The 1,200-meter stage was where Morgan expected to separate herself from the middle of the pack. This was the distance where superior training and experience should show. But as she observed the other competitors, she noticed something troubling. Davis, who had been assigned to Station 1, was using what appeared to be a brand-new rifle system for this stage, different from what he'd used earlier. Through her spotting scope, Morgan could see it was an advanced prototype with features she didn't recognize. "Impressive piece of equipment your teammate has," commented Muller, who had also noticed the change. "Must be nice to have friends in high places." Morgan said nothing, focusing on her own preparation. When her turn came, she shot well, placing all 3 rounds within the 9-ring, despite increasingly difficult wind conditions. But when the final scores for Day 1 were posted, she had slipped to 5th place. Davis maintained his lead with Volkov, and the British operator tied for 2nd. As the competitors secured their weapons and prepared to leave the range, Morgan found herself face-to-face with Davis for the first time. "Nice shooting for standard issue," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't entirely a compliment. "Thank you," Morgan replied evenly. "You switched rifles for the long-range stage." Davis smiled, patting the case that held his new weapon. L-115A4, latest prototype. Integrated ballistic computer calculates range, wind, temperature, humidity, even barometric pressure. Takes most of the guesswork out of long-range shooting. "Must be nice," Morgan said, echoing Muller's earlier comment. "It's not about making things easier." "Staff Sergeant," Davis replied, his smile fading. "It's about maximizing effectiveness. In combat, every advantage matters." "In combat, you don't always have perfect equipment," Morgan countered. "Sometimes you have to make do with what you've got." "True," Davis conceded. "But when you have access to superior technology, only a fool would ignore it." He glanced meaningfully at her standard issue M24. "Maybe that's why you're picking up brass while guys like me are still in operational units." Before Morgan could respond, Davis walked away, leaving her seething. She was still standing there when Harrison approached. "Don't let him get to you," the older man said, having overheard the exchange. "That's exactly what they want." "It's not just him, Sarge," Morgan said quietly. "Look at the equipment these guys are using. I'm at a serious disadvantage." Harrison studied her face. "Your father ever tell you about the time he outshot the entire Kuwaiti Special Forces team with an old M14 while they were all using brand-new SR-25s? Despite her frustration, Morgan smiled. "Only about 100 times." "And what did he always say?" "It's not the arrow, it's the Indian," Morgan recited. "Damn straight." Harrison clapped her on the shoulder. "Besides, I've been watching your rifle all day. Check your scope when you get back to your quarters. I think someone's been messing with your zero." Morgan frowned. "What? The elevation adjustment. It's off by at least 2 MOA from where you set it this morning. I've been watching you compensate all day without even realizing it." A chill ran down Morgan's spine. Someone had tampered with her equipment just enough to throw off her shooting without being immediately obvious. "I should report this," she said. Harrison shook his head. "And say what?" "That someone touched your scope when you weren't looking, with no proof. They'll say you're making excuses for not shooting as well as the men." Morgan knew he was right. "So what do I do?" You do what you've always done, Harrison said firmly. You adapt, you overcome, and you don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you complain. Morgan nodded slowly. Tomorrow's unknown distance day. No rangefinders allowed. A slow smile spread across Harrison's weathered face. Exactly. Tomorrow all those fancy gadgets won't matter. It'll be about skill judgment and experience all the things you have in spades. And the tampering. Keep your rifle with you at all times, Harrison advised. And check your zero every morning before you shoot. They may try to throw you off, but they can't stop you if you're prepared. As they walked back toward the housing area, Morgan spotted Winters talking with Davis in hushed tones near the administration building. The two men fell silent as Morgan and Harrison passed, their expressions neutral, but their eyes following the pair. "Told you," Harrison muttered. "They're thick as thieves, those two." Back in her quarters, Morgan carefully examined her rifle. Harrison had been right. The elevation adjustment on her scope had been altered by approximately 2 MOA, enough to cause significant deviation at longer ranges. She reset it to the correct position and made a mental note to verify it before each stage of the competition. As she was finishing, another knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Captain Hayes standing there. "May I come in, Sergeant?" Hayes asked. Morgan stepped aside, allowing the officer to enter. Hayes closed the door behind her and spoke in a low voice. "Be careful around Davis," she said without preamble. "He and Winters have history. They've run multiple black ops together in Syria and Yemen." "He had a prototype rifle today," Morgan replied. "Something I've never seen before." Hayes nodded. "DARPA project, not even officially in field trials yet. Winters pulled strings to get it here. And someone tampered with my scope." Hayes didn't look surprised. "Can you prove it?" "No." "Then be vigilant. This is only the beginning." Hayes moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Tomorrow's unknown distance course, Winters redesigned it last week. It's significantly more difficult than what was originally planned." "Why are you helping me?" Morgan asked. Hayes's expression softened slightly. "Because 20 years ago, I was you. And no one stood up for me." She straightened, her official demeanor returning. "Get some rest, Sergeant. Tomorrow will be challenging." After Hayes left, Morgan sat on the edge of her bunk, deep in thought. The competition had barely begun, and already the deck was stacked against her. But in a strange way, this only strengthened her resolve. She had spent her entire career overcoming obstacles and defying expectations. This would be no different. Day 2 dawned with a brutal heat that promised to test the competitors' endurance as much as their marksmanship. The unknown distance course had been set up in a canyon area several miles from the main facility, a winding route through rocky terrain with targets placed at various hidden locations. "Today's challenge," announced Commander Winters to the assembled competitors, "will test your ability to estimate distance, rad conditions, and engage targets without the aid of rangefinders or ballistic computers. You will move through the course individually, engaging 10 targets. Scoring is based on accuracy and first-round hits." Morgan noticed Davis scowling slightly. Without his high-tech rifle's integrated systems, the playing field was suddenly more level. "Competitors will begin at 5-minute intervals," Winters continued. "Order determined by random draw." When the drawing was complete, Morgan found herself scheduled to start 12th, roughly in the middle of the pack. Davis would go 4th, giving him an advantage in terms of course conditions. As the first competitors began their runs, Morgan used the time to prepare mentally reviewing techniques for estimating distance using visual references. This was an area where her combat experience gave her an edge. In Afghanistan, she had often needed to make these calculations quickly and accurately without technological assistance. When Davis returned from his run, his expression was thunderous. Morgan overheard him complaining to another American operator, "Bullshit course! No way to effectively use proper technique with those target placements." Morgan suppressed a smile. Perhaps today wouldn't be so bad after all. When her turn came, she moved through the course methodically. The targets were indeed challenging, positioned in shadow partially obscured by terrain, or placed where mirage effects made them difficult to see clearly. But these were exactly the conditions she had faced in real combat. For each target, she carefully observed environmental indicators, vegetation, movement for wind, heat waves, for temperature effects, the way light reflected off surfaces. She mentally calculated distances based on the apparent size of known objects, then made adjustments for elevation and environmental factors. Her first few shots were solid hits, boosting her confidence as she moved deeper into the canyon. By the seventh target, she had found her rhythm moving efficiently between firing positions and making first-round hits. The final target was the most difficult, a small silhouette partially hidden behind a rock outcropping at what Morgan estimated to be approximately 950 meters. The wind was swirling unpredictably in the canyon, making it nearly impossible to get an accurate reading. Morgan took extra time with this one, observing how dust particles moved at various distances between her and the target. She noticed a pattern to the swirling winds and waited for the optimal moment in the cycle before taking her shot. The bullet struck dead center. When she returned to the staging area, she found Harrison waiting, a rare grin splitting his weathered face. "How'd I do?" she asked. "You're in first place," he replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Perfect score. 8 first-round hits, 2 second-round hits. No one else has managed better than 7 first-rounders." Morgan allowed herself a small smile. "Guess all those hours in the Hindu Kush paid off." "Guess they did," Harrison agreed. "Davis is currently in 4th. The Russian Volkov is 2nd, and the German Müller is 3rd. As they spoke, Volkov himself approached. The Russian had said virtually nothing since the competition began, but now he nodded respectfully to Morgan. "Good shooting today," he said, his accent thick but understandable. "You have real combat experience. It shows." "Thank you," Morgan replied, surprised by the unexpected acknowledgement. "I was in Afghanistan, same time as you," Volkov continued. "Perhaps we were on opposite sides of same mountain." A ghost of a smile crossed his usually impassive face. "Is better to meet here, I think." With that cryptic comment, he walked away, leaving Morgan slightly stunned by what, coming from the taciturn Russian, amounted to effusive praise. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Harrison. "Respect from a Spetsnaz operator. Don't see that every day." The day's final standings confirmed Morgan's lead in the unknown distance event, moving her up to 3rd place overall. Davis had fallen to 2nd, with Volkov now in the lead by a narrow margin. The atmosphere at dinner that evening was noticeably different. Several competitors who had previously ignored Morgan now nodded in acknowledgement as she passed. She had proven herself on a level playing field, and that earned a measure of respect, however grudging. Only Davis seemed more hostile than before, glaring at her from across the mess hall. And Winters was conspicuously absent, having been called away for administrative matters, according to the staff. As Morgan was returning to her quarters after dinner, she spotted Winters and Davis in intense conversation near the administration building. They fell silent as she approached both men, watching her with barely concealed animosity. "Congratulations on today's performance, Staff Sergeant," Winters said, his tone making it clear this was not a sincere compliment. "Quite impressive for someone with limited recent field experience." "Thank you, sir," Morgan replied neutrally. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Davis added. Tomorrow's a whole different ball game. Morgan said nothing, continuing past them to her quarters, but their words lingered in her mind. Tomorrow's challenge, the 20-kilometer trek through desert terrain, would indeed test her in new ways. Her injured shoulder, while mostly healed, still ached after prolonged physical exertion. A full day of hiking with a heavy pack and rifle would push her to her limits. She was preparing her gear for the next day when another knock came at her door. This time it was Harrison, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, entering and closing the door firmly behind him. "I overheard Winters and Davis. They're planning something for tomorrow." Morgan's stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" "The course tomorrow includes a navigation component," Harrison explained. "Each competitor will be given coordinates for checkpoint locations where targets are positioned. Davis is assigned to start just before you, and I heard Winters tell him to make sure she gets lost." Morgan frowned. "How would he do that? By giving you false information if you end up on the same part of the course? Or by obscuring trail markers? I don't know exactly, but they're definitely plotting something." Morgan considered this information. "I'll just have to be extra careful with my navigation." Harrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's more. I don't think your scope adjustment yesterday was an isolated incident. From what I gathered, they've been messing with your equipment since you arrived." "My rifle's been with me, or locked up since then," Morgan pointed out. "Not your ammunition," Harrison countered. "Each competitor is issued standard match-grade rounds each morning. It would be easy enough to give you rounds with slightly different load characteristics, enough to affect accuracy without being immediately obvious." Morgan felt a chill. "That would be outright cheating. You think they care about playing fair?" Harrison shook his head. "They care about making sure you fail. Period." Morgan sat heavily on her bunk, the full weight of what she was up against settling on her shoulders. "What do I do?" "Sarge?" Harrison sat beside her. "You do what you've always done. You prepare for the worst, and adapt to whatever comes. Check your ammo tomorrow morning, look for any inconsistencies in how the rounds seat in the chamber, and trust your instincts on the navigation. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't." He paused, then added more softly, "And remember why you're here. Not just for yourself, but for every woman who'll come after you." Morgan nodded, drawing strength from his words. "I won't let them win, Sarge. Not like this." Harrison squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's my girl." As he left, Morgan finished preparing her gear with renewed determination. Tomorrow would be challenging, but she had faced worse odds in Afghanistan and prevailed. This was just another mission, another chance to prove herself, and she had no intention of failing. The third day of competition began before dawn, with competitors assembled under a star-filled sky. Each wore full combat gear, plate carriers, helmets, sidearms, and their primary rifles, along with packs containing water ammunition and essential equipment. The combined weight was over 60 pounds. "Today's challenge," announced Captain Hayes, who was overseeing this portion of the competition, "combines navigation endurance and precision marksmanship. You will traverse a 20-kilometer course through desert terrain, locating and engaging targets at 5 checkpoint locations. Your score will be based on accuracy, time, and successful navigation." She held up a sealed envelope. "Each competitor will receive coordinates for their checkpoints just before starting. These coordinates are slightly different for each of you to prevent following. You will be released at 15-minute intervals to ensure separation on the course." Morgan listened carefully, noting that this differed from what Harrison had told her. If each competitor had different checkpoint coordinates, how could Davis interfere with her navigation? Unless Her thoughts were interrupted as Hayes continued. The course must be completed within 8 hours. Failure to locate all checkpoints or engage all targets will result in significant point deductions. Water resupply is available at checkpoint 3 only. Davis was assigned to start 5th, while Morgan would begin 9th. This meant he would be well ahead of her on the course, limiting opportunities for direct interference. Perhaps Harrison had misunderstood what he'd overheard. When Morgan's start time arrived, Hayes handed her the sealed envelope containing her checkpoint coordinates. "Good luck, Staff Sergeant," she said, her expression revealing nothing. "Thank you, ma'am," Morgan replied, breaking the seal. Inside, she found a laminated card with GPS coordinates for 5 locations, along with compass bearings between points. As she programmed the first set into her GPS unit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The course began with a steep climb up a rocky hillside, challenging even before the desert heat took hold. Morgan settled into a steady pace, conserving energy for the long day ahead. Her shoulder began to ache within the first kilometer, but she pushed through the discomfort, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing and footfalls. She reached the first checkpoint, a small ravine marked with a red flag exactly where the coordinates indicated. There she found a range officer waiting with a spotting scope. The target was positioned 600 meters away, partially obscured by brush. Morgan set up quickly, made her wind and elevation calculations, and fired. The bullet struck just left of center, a solid hit but not perfect. She attributed it to the slight shaking in her arms from the climb and continued on toward the second checkpoint. The day grew hotter as the sun climbed higher, the temperature pushing past 95 degrees by mid-morning. Morgan rationed her water carefully, knowing dehydration would affect her shooting performance. The terrain became increasingly difficult, loose sand and rock that shifted underfoot, sapping energy with each step. At the second checkpoint, she engaged a target at 800 meters, with better results placing her shot in the 10 ring. So far, the navigation had been straightforward, matching her coordinates precisely. It was after the third checkpoint that things began to go wrong. Morgan had refilled her water supply and was following the bearing toward checkpoint 4 when she noticed the terrain didn't match what should have been ahead based on her map. According to her coordinates, she should be approaching a dry riverbed. Instead, she faced a steep ridge that wasn't indicated on her map. She double-checked her GPS and compass, confirming she was on the correct bearing. Something was definitely wrong. Either her coordinates were incorrect, or the map she'd been issued didn't accurately represent the terrain. Morgan stopped considering her options. She could continue on the bearing and hope to find the checkpoint, potentially wasting valuable time and energy if it wasn't there. Or she could try to reorient based on visible landmarks, which might lead her off course if her coordinates were actually correct. She thought back to her father's lessons about navigation. "When in doubt, get to high ground," he'd always said. "See the bigger picture." Decision made, Morgan began climbing the unexpected ridge. The ascent was grueling in the midday heat, her gear feeling twice as heavy as when she started. By the time she reached the top, her uniform was soaked with sweat, and her shoulder throbbed painfully. But the view was worth it. From this vantage point, she could see much of the surrounding terrain, including what appeared to be a small outpost about 2 kilometers to the northwest, likely checkpoint 4. It was nowhere near where her coordinates indicated it should be. Her coordinates had been deliberately falsified. The realization sent a surge of anger through her. This wasn't just interference. It was outright sabotage. If she hadn't questioned the discrepancy and climbed the ridge, she might have wandered for hours in the wrong direction, possibly failing to complete the course within the time limit. Morgan took a deep breath, calming herself. Anger wouldn't help her now. She needed to focus on the solution, not the problem. She marked the visible checkpoint on her map, plotted a new route, and began making her way down the ridge. The detour had cost her nearly an hour, time she couldn't afford to lose if she wanted to complete the course within the 8-hour limit. She pushed her pace, ignoring the protests from her body. When she finally reached checkpoint 4, the range officer checked his watch with surprise. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, you're later than expected." "Had some navigation issues," she replied tersely, moving immediately to set up for her shot. The target at this station was positioned at an awkward angle, requiring her to shoot from an uncomfortable prone position that put extra strain on her injured shoulder. Despite the discomfort, Morgan made a clean hit in the 9-ring. As she packed up to continue the range, officer mentioned casually, "You're the first one through this checkpoint today." Morgan frowned. "That can't be right. Several competitors started before me." The officer checked his log. "No one else has reached this station yet." Confusion gave way to understanding as Morgan realized the implications. If no one else had reached this checkpoint, then either everyone had received the same false coordinates she had, or more likely, she was on an entirely different course than the other competitors. She was being tested on a more difficult route. The final checkpoint and target proved to be equally challenging, positioned in a location that required a grueling climb, followed by a shooting position that offered minimal stability. But Morgan was beyond fatigue now, operating on determination alone. She made her shot striking within the 8-ring, not her best, but respectable given the circumstances. The sun was low on the horizon by the time she crossed the finish line, her body pushed to its limits. The official time, 7 hours and 42 minutes, just under the 8-hour cutoff. She had completed one of the most physically demanding days of her life. As she handed in her scorecard, Morgan spotted Davis lounging in a chair under a canopy, looking remarkably fresh. He smirked as she approached. "Tough day, Morgan?" he asked. "You look like you've been through hell." "How long did the course take you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. 5 hours, 17 minutes, he replied smugly. "Easiest nav course I've ever run. Checkpoints were right where they were supposed to be." Morgan said nothing, simply nodding and walking away. She found Harrison waiting near the medical tent, concern evident on his face. "Jesus, Morgan, you look half dead," he said, helping her to a seat in the shade. "What happened out there?" Morgan accepted a bottle of water from a nearby cooler, drinking deeply before answering. "My coordinates were wrong, completely wrong, and according to the range officer at checkpoint 4, I was on a different course than everyone else." Harrison's expression darkened. "Son of a bitch. They're not even trying to hide it anymore." "The good news is, I finished within the time limit," Morgan said. "The bad news is, my shooting suffered. I'm probably going to drop in the standings." "Don't be so sure," Harrison replied. "Word is, a lot of competitors struggled today. Even Davis missed a shot at the final checkpoint." Before Morgan could respond, Captain Hayes approached her, expression carefully neutral. "Staff Sergeant Morgan medical evaluation is mandatory after completing the course. Please report to the medical tent." Morgan nodded, too exhausted to argue. As she stood, Hayes added in a lower voice, "You completed the senior instructor course today, not the competitor course. A navigation error in the assignment process." Her tone made it clear this had been no error. In the medical tent, a corpsman checked Morgan's vital signs and examined her shoulder. "You've got some inflammation here," he noted. "Nothing serious, but you should ice it tonight and take anti-inflammatories." "Will I be cleared for tomorrow?" Morgan asked. The corpsman hesitated. "That's up to the medical officer, but I don't see why not. Just take it easy tonight." As Morgan left the medical tent, she found Harrison deep in conversation with Volkov, the Russian operator. They fell silent as she approached. "What's going on?" she asked. Harrison glanced at Volkov, who nodded slightly. "Tell her." "Our friend here has some interesting information," Harrison said. "Apparently, you weren't the only one who faced navigation errors today." 3 of us had different courses, Volkov explained, his voice low. You, me, and Mueller, all challenging competitors from day 2. Morgan processed this information. So they're targeting anyone who might beat their golden boy. It would seem so, Volkov agreed. But there is more. Tomorrow's stress shooting event, I have heard the Americans have been practicing the course for weeks. They know exactly what to expect. How do you know this? Morgan asked. A rare smile crossed the Russian's face. In my country, we have saying, trust but verify. I verify everything. After Volkov departed, Harrison helped Morgan back to her quarters. You need to rest. Tomorrow will be another tough day. They're not even pretending to make this fair, Morgan said, the full weight of the day's events settling on her. How am I supposed to compete when they keep changing the rules? Harrison's expression softened. Your father ever tell you about the time he was sent on a recon mission with faulty intelligence? Morgan nodded. The Kuwait operation. They gave him the wrong coordinates, outdated maps, and half the equipment he requested. And what did he do? He completed the mission anyway, Morgan recited. Said it was the best thing that ever happened to him because it taught him to trust his instincts over his orders. Harrison smiled. Exactly. They can throw whatever they want at you, Morgan, but they can't take away what's in here. He tapped her forehead. And in here? He placed his hand over his heart. Morgan managed a tired smile. Thanks, Sarge. Get some rest, Harrison repeated. Tomorrow's another day. As Harrison turned to leave, he suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. Sarge! Morgan was on her feet, instantly catching Harrison as he staggered. What's wrong? Nothing, he gasped. Just indigestion. But Morgan recognized the signs immediately. Medic, she shouted toward the door. I need a medic here now. Within minutes, Harrison was surrounded by medical personnel, an oxygen mask over his face, as they loaded him onto a stretcher. The diagnosis was preliminary, but serious, a possible heart attack. I'm coming with you, Morgan insisted as they prepared to transport him to the nearest hospital. Negative, Staff Sergeant, said the senior medical officer firmly. You're in the middle of a competition. There's nothing you can do for him right now. He's my friend, Morgan protested, and he'd want you to finish what you started. The officer replied, his tone softening slightly. We'll take good care of him. That's a promise. As the ambulance pulled away, Morgan stood alone in the gathering darkness, her exhaustion now compounded by worry and a growing sense of isolation. Harrison had been her rock, her connection to her father, her reminder of why she was fighting so hard. And now, facing the most challenging days of the competition, she was truly on her own. Back in her quarters, Morgan sat on the edge of her bunkhead, in her hands. The day's physical toll combined with the emotional shock of Harrison's collapse left her feeling more vulnerable than she had in years. For a brief moment, she considered withdrawing from the competition. What was the point of continuing when the deck was so obviously stacked against her? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Captain Hayes standing there, her expression uncharacteristically sympathetic. I heard about Sergeant Major Harrison, Hayes said. I'm sorry. Do you know his condition? Morgan asked. Hayes shook her head. No update yet, but that's not why I'm here. She stepped inside, closing the door. I want to talk about today's navigation error. Morgan's fatigue gave way to a flash of anger. You mean the deliberate sabotage? I can't officially acknowledge that, Hayes replied carefully. But I can tell you that tomorrow's event has also been modified. Let me guess, Morgan said bitterly. Another special course just for me. No, Hayes answered. But the stress shooting scenarios have been designed to exploit your specific weaknesses, particularly your injured shoulder. Morgan wasn't surprised. And Davis has been practicing these scenarios for weeks, according to Volkov. Hayes nodded. Winters has been grooming him for this competition since before you were invited. Why are you telling me this? Morgan asked the question that had been nagging at her since their first conversation. Hayes was silent for a moment, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal something more personal. 20 years ago, I was considered for Force Recon before women were officially allowed in combat roles. I had the scores, the skills, everything it took. But I was sabotaged by men who couldn't accept a woman in their ranks. She paused, a hint of old pain in her eyes. No one stood up for me then. No one said a word when my equipment mysteriously malfunctioned, when my evaluations were altered, when my achievements were attributed to special treatment. I swore if I ever saw it happening to someone else, I wouldn't stay silent. Morgan was touched by the revelation. I appreciate that, ma'am, but knowing doesn't help much if I can't do anything about it. That's where you're wrong, Hayes replied, her resolve strengthening. Knowing is half the battle. If you know what's coming, you can prepare. And I can help with that. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. This is the layout for tomorrow's stress shooting course. Memorize it, then destroy it. I was never here. Morgan accepted the paper, stunned by the risk Hayes was taking. Thank you. Hayes moved to the door, then paused. Staff Sergeant Morgan, I don't know if Harrison will be back for the final days of this competition, but I want you to know something. She turned, meeting Morgan's gaze directly. That old man believes in you more than I've ever seen anyone believe in anything. Don't let him down. With that, she was gone, leaving Morgan holding the course diagram and feeling, for the first time in hours, a renewed sense of purpose. She might be alone now, but she was far from defeated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she would face them as she had faced every obstacle in her career, with determination, skill, and the unwavering belief that she belonged here, regardless of what Winters and his cronies thought. For Harrison, for Hayes, for her father, and for every woman who would come after her, Morgan would continue the fight. The battle was far from over. Dawn broke over the Utah desert, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The air was crisp, the morning sky cloudless, perfect conditions for the final day of competition. Staff Sergeant Alexis Morgan stood at the edge of the firing range, watching as military officials and media personnel set up their equipment. Camera crews positioned themselves at strategic locations, their lenses already trained on the firing line. Today was the day. The culmination of the competition, the extreme long-range precision challenge. Morgan had arrived earlier than necessary, seeking a moment of solitude before the pressure of the day descended fully. In her pocket she carried two items, a worn photograph of her father in desert camouflage, and a small note that Harrison had pressed into her hand before being loaded into the ambulance the previous evening. She unfolded the note, now reading the simple message again, "Trust yourself, Bull." The past 24 hours had been some of the most challenging of her career. Day 4's stress shooting event had tested her to the limit physically, mentally, and emotionally. Without Harrison's steady presence, she'd felt adrift, but Captain Hayes's covert assistance had proven invaluable. The course layout Hayes had provided allowed Morgan to prepare mentally for each stage, countering Winters' attempts to exploit her injured shoulder. She had finished the day in second place overall, just behind Volkov, with Davis dropping to third after an unexpected equipment malfunction. The rankings meant Morgan would shoot 8th in today's final challenge, not ideal, but not terrible either. As competitors and officials began to arrive, Morgan tucked her father's photo and Harrison's note back into her pocket. She had no illusions about what awaited her. This final test, a single shot at 3,500 meters, would determine everything. Sergeant Morgan. She turned to find Captain Hayes approaching her, expression carefully neutral, despite the tension evident in her posture. "Captain," Morgan acknowledged. "Any word on Sergeant Major Harrison?" Hayes asked quietly. "Stable condition. They're keeping him for observation, but the doctors say he should make a full recovery." Hayes nodded. "Good, that's good." She hesitated, then added, "Be careful today. Winters is unsettled by your performance yesterday." Meaning he's running out of ways to ensure you fail." Hayes glanced over her shoulder, checking that no one was within earshot. "The rifle for today's challenge was secured last night, but I wouldn't put it past him to have made, adjustments." Morgan had anticipated as much. "I'll manage?" "I'm sure you will." Hayes straightened her official demeanor, returning. "Good luck, Staff Sergeant." As Hayes walked away, Morgan caught sight of Commander Winters arriving with Davis at his side. Both men looked her way, their expressions hard. Winters whispered something to Davis, who nodded and moved toward the equipment area. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the full contingent of competitors and officials assembled. Media representatives mingled with military observers, including several high-ranking officers from various branches. Morgan recognized insignia from Army Special Forces Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Special Operations, as well as several foreign military dignitaries. At precisely 0900, Commander Winters called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final event of the first International Special Operations Sniper Competition. Today's challenge represents the pinnacle of precision marksmanship, engaging a target at 3,500 meters with a single shot." He gestured toward the distant mountainside where a barely visible silhouette target had been positioned. To put this in perspective, the current world record for the longest confirmed kill in combat is 3,540 meters. Most of you will not even hit the target today. A select few may get lucky. But true mastery at this distance is exceedingly rare. Morgan noticed the subtle emphasis Winters placed on the word lucky, a clear reference to their confrontation at Fort Bragg. She kept her expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. To ensure a level playing field, Winters continued, "All competitors will use the same weapon system, a Barrett M107 50 caliber sniper rifle with standard optics. No electronic aids, no ballistic computers, no wind meters. Just you, the rifle, and your skill." Winters explained that order would be determined by current standings, with the lowest-ranked competitor shooting first and the leader shooting last. This placed Volkov in the final position, with Morgan preceding him. Each shooter will have 20 minutes to assess conditions and make calculations, followed by a single shot. Scoring is simple: a miss receives 0 points, a hit anywhere on the target receives 10 points, and a hit within the center mass zone receives 20 points. This final event is weighted heavily in the overall competition standings, meaning a perfect shot today could change everything. As the first competitor prepared to shoot, Morgan studied the conditions carefully. The wind was steady at 8 mph from the southwest near the firing line, but she could see indications that it shifted more westerly further downrange. Temperature was 78 degrees. Humidity, a dry 15%, and barometric pressure was 29.85 inches of mercury. Each of these factors would affect the bullet's trajectory over such an extreme distance. The first shooter was a Spanish operator who had struggled throughout the competition. After careful preparation, he fired his shot and missed completely. The spotter could find no impact near the target. The second shooter, an Israeli, likewise missed. The third, an Australian, did the same. Morgan watched carefully as each competitor took their turn. By the time Muller the German stepped up to the firing line, no one had yet hit the target. Muller took his time making meticulous adjustments before firing. The shot echoed across the range, and after a tense wait, the spotter called out, "Hit! Left edge of target!" A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. The first successful engagement at this distance was impressive by any standard. When Davis's turn came, the American moved with practiced confidence. Morgan noticed him exchange a glance with Winters before taking position behind the rifle. He made a show of studying conditions, though Morgan suspected he'd been given detailed information in advance. Davis fired, and the bullet struck the target in the lower right quadrant, not center mass, but a solid hit nonetheless. "2 hits," commented a British officer standing near Morgan. "Impressive shooting. More impressive considering they're using the same rifle," added his colleague. "Shows it's the shooter, not the equipment." Morgan silently agreed. As the remaining competitors took their turns, most missing completely, she mentally rehearsed her approach. The distance was daunting, over 2 miles. At that range, a bullet fired from the .50 caliber rifle would take approximately 4 seconds to reach the target, dropping nearly 500 feet from line of sight and drifting considerably with the wind. When her turn finally came, Morgan approached the firing position with calm determination. She knelt beside the rifle, examining it carefully before taking position behind it. Almost immediately, she noticed something was wrong. The scope's adjustment dials felt different, slightly looser than they should be. As she peered through the optic, she confirmed her suspicion the zero had been altered, likely just before her turn. Based on the settings, any shot she took would impact well right of her aim point enough to miss the target entirely at this distance. Morgan felt a presence beside her and glanced up to see Captain Hayes, who had positioned herself as the official observer for Morgan's attempt. Their eyes met briefly, and Hayes gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the scope. "Scope's been adjusted," Hayes murmured, just loud enough for Morgan to hear. "At least 3 MOA to the right." Morgan faced an immediate decision report, the tampering and risk being labeled as making excuses or adjust her aim to compensate. The choice was clear. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, is there a problem?" Winters called from behind the line, his voice carrying just enough for nearby media to hear. "No problem, sir," Morgan replied evenly. "Just getting familiar with the weapon." She settled behind the rifle, ignoring the whispers from the audience. A reporter nearby asked loudly enough to be heard, "Is that the only woman in the competition?" "Yes," Winters replied, his voice carrying deliberately. "Remarkable that she's even attempting this shot. A rather non-traditional competitor." Morgan tuned out the commentary, focusing entirely on the task at hand. She began her calculations, factoring in the sabotaged scope along with all the environmental conditions. With the scope offset to the right, she would need to aim significantly left of the target to compensate on top of the already substantial windage adjustment needed for the crosswind. As she worked, memories surfaced unbidden. Her father teaching her to shoot on their Texas ranch when she was just 12 years old. "Remember, Lexi, the moment of the shot isn't what matters. It's the moment before, when everything goes quiet, when you become part of the rifle, when you can feel the bullet's path before it even leaves the barrel." Harrison's lessons echoed in her mind. "You don't shoot with your hands or your eyes, Morgan. You shoot with your heart. When everything else fails, trust your instincts." Her mother's words, spoken years ago when Morgan first faced resistance to her chosen path. Sometimes you have to prove yourself 10 times over before the world sees what you've always known about yourself. Drawing strength from these memories, Morgan made her final adjustments. The compensation for the tampered scope meant she would be aiming at what appeared to be empty space far left of the visible target. To anyone watching, it would look like she was making a fundamental error. "Any time now, Staff Sergeant," Winters called out, impatience evident in his tone. Morgan ignored him, continuing her methodical preparation. She studied the movement of heat waves rising from the desert floor, the subtle shifts in vegetation that indicated wind patterns, the quality of light on the mountainside where the target waited. When she was finally ready, Morgan settled into her shooting position. She slowed her breathing, established her natural point of aim, and relaxed into the rifle. The stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, her cheek welded to the comb, her eye perfectly aligned with the scope. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled half her breath, finding that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats. The crosshairs steadied on a point that seemed absurdly distant from the target, a compensation for both the tremendous windage at this range and the deliberately misaligned scope. The world narrowed to this single moment. The murmurs of the crowd faded away. The weight of expectations, her own Harrison's, her father's, dissolved into perfect clarity. Morgan took up the first pressure on the trigger, then applied steady, increasing force, until the rifle fired almost as a surprise. The massive .50 caliber rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report thundering across the desert. Through the scope, Morgan tracked where she believed the bullet would impact, though at this distance it would take nearly 4 seconds to reach the target. 4 seconds that stretched into eternity. The crowd had fallen completely silent, all eyes focused either on the target or on spotting scopes. Morgan remained perfectly still behind the rifle, continuing to look through the scope, though she could see little at this distance. Suddenly, the primary spotter jolted upright. "Hit!" he exclaimed, disbelief evident in his voice. "Center, mass!" A shocked murmur ran through the crowd, quickly escalating into a buzz of excitement. Several officials rushed to check the spotter's telescope. "Confirmed hit," announced the range officer. "Dead center." The announcement sent a wave of astonishment through the assembled observers. Even competitors who had missed entirely were shaking their heads in amazement. Davis stood frozen, his expression shifting from disbelief to barely contained fury. Commander Winters pushed through the crowd, demanding to see for himself. He spent a long moment peering through the spotting scope, his back rigid with tension. When he finally straightened, his face had paled slightly. "Confirmed," he said tightly. "Center mass hit at 3,500 meters." Reporters surged forward, cameras and microphones extended toward Morgan, who was still kneeling beside the rifle, calmly packing up her equipment. "Staff Sergeant Morgan, how did you make that shot with standard equipment? No ballistic computer, no advanced optics." Morgan glanced up at the cluster of media, choosing her words carefully. "It's not about the equipment," she said simply. "It's about 20 years of experience and training from one of the best men who ever held a rifle." More questions followed, but Morgan deflected most of them, acknowledging only that yes, this was likely the longest precision shot of her career, and no, she hadn't expected to hit center mass. A solid hit anywhere on the target would have been an achievement at this distance. As the remaining competitors completed their attempts, none matching Morgan's precision, she found herself standing apart from the crowd, processing what had just occurred. Against all odds, despite deliberate sabotage, she had made what might be one of the most remarkable shots in the history of military marksmanship. The final competitor was Volkov, whose stoic demeanor had remained unchanged throughout the competition. As the Russian took his position behind the rifle, Morgan noticed something unusual. He systematically checked the scope adjustments, much as she had done, his expression darkening slightly. He too had discovered tampering. Volkov made his adjustments methodically, then fired his shot with the same emotionless precision he'd demonstrated throughout the week. After the customary wait, the spotter called out, Hit 2 inches right of center mass. An excellent shot, nearly as good as Morgan's, and made despite the same handicap. When Volkov rose from behind the rifle, his eyes met Morgan's briefly across the range. He gave her a single respectful nod. As the range officers collected the final data and prepared for the closing ceremony, Captain Hayes approached Morgan. "Remarkable shooting, Staff Sergeant," she said formally for the benefit of anyone listening. Then, lowering her voice, she added, "I have evidence of Davis tampering with the scope between shooters. He adjusted it before your turn, and again before Volkov's. On Winter's orders." Morgan absorbed this information calmly. "Will you report it?" Hayes hesitated. "That depends on you. It would create a significant scandal potentially damaging to multiple careers, including Winter's." Morgan considered the implications. Public exposure would validate what she had accomplished, proving she had overcome deliberate sabotage. But it would also overshadow the shot itself, turning a demonstration of skill into a political controversy. "No," she decided. "Let it go. What happened on the range speaks for itself." Hayes studied her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Morgan smiled slightly. "Besides, making that shot, despite their interference, is a better statement than any official report." The award ceremony was held that afternoon under a massive canopy erected to shield attendees from the desert sun. The final standings reflected the dramatic events of the day: Morgan in first place, Volkov a close second, and Davis relegated to third, a result that clearly displeased Commander Winters, who presided over the ceremony with barely concealed tension. As Morgan accepted the champion's trophy, a stylized bronze figure of a sniper in prone position, she noticed several high-ranking officers watching her with interest, including a 3-star Army general she recognized as the commander of Special Operations Command. Following the ceremony, as competitors and officials mingled during the reception, Morgan found herself approached by Commander Winters. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy. "Impressive performance, Staff Sergeant," he said, extending his hand. "I underestimated you." Morgan accepted the handshake with equal formality. "Thank you, sir." Winters lowered his voice. A word in private. She followed him to a quiet corner of the reception area, maintaining a careful distance. Up close, she could see the strain in his features, a man unused to having his plans thwarted. "I want to offer you a position," he said without preamble, "instructor at the SEAL Sniper School. Someone with your skills shouldn't be cleaning up brass casings." The offer caught Morgan by surprise, though she quickly recognized it for what it was: not recognition of her abilities, but an attempt to control the narrative and potentially silence her about the competition's irregularities. "I appreciate the offer, Commander," she replied carefully, "but I'd need time to consider it." "Of course." Winters's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though I should mention such opportunities don't come along every day, especially for someone in your situation." The implied threat was clear: accept his offer or return to obscurity at Fort Bragg. Before Morgan could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of the 3-star general she had noticed earlier. "Commander Winters," the general said, his tone pleasant but authoritative. "I need to borrow Staff Sergeant Morgan for a moment, if you don't mind." Winters snapped to attention. "Of course not, sir." As Winters retreated, the general extended his hand to Morgan. "General Robert Hayden, Special Operations Command. Walk with me, Sergeant." They moved away from the reception toward the edge of the encampment. When they were out of earshot of others, the general spoke candidly. "That was quite a shot today, Staff Sergeant, especially considering the circumstances." Morgan glanced at him sharply. "Sir, Captain Hayes briefed me on certain irregularities in the competition, off the record, of course." His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were keen. I also spoke with Sergeant Major Harrison this morning. Quite an advocate you have there. Harrison is conscious, Morgan asked momentarily, forgetting protocol in her relief. The general smiled. And argumentative as ever. He had quite a lot to say about you, Commander Winters, and this competition. Morgan maintained her professional demeanor, uncertain where this conversation was heading. I understand Winters offered you a position, the general continued. Yes, sir, at the SEAL Sniper School. General Hayden nodded thoughtfully. A prestigious assignment, though I suspect it's not what you really want. Morgan hesitated, then decided on honesty. No, sir, it's not. What do you want, Staff Sergeant Morgan? The question caught her off guard. For years, her focus had been on proving herself in a system that often seemed designed to make her fail. She had rarely allowed herself to consider what she truly wanted. I want to use my skills, sir, she finally answered. Not just for myself, but to help others develop theirs. I've been thinking about training, passing on what I've learned to the next generation of soldiers. The general nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he already knew. As it happens, Staff Sergeant, I recently authorized the creation of an advanced sniper training program at Fort Bragg. The program will focus on developing elite marksmen for special operations support roles, drawing candidates from across all branches. We need a director, someone with exceptional skills, combat experience, and the ability to innovate beyond traditional doctrine. Morgan felt her pulse quicken as she realized what he was suggesting. Someone like you, the general concluded. Sir, I'm honored, but you're not qualified on paper, he finished for her. Technically, you need to be a master sergeant to direct a program of this level. So effective immediately, you're being promoted to master sergeant and reassigned to the Advanced Sniper Training Program as its founding director. Morgan struggled to maintain her composure. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Say you'll build me the best damn sniper program in the military, General Hayden replied. And say you'll ensure it's open to any qualified candidate regardless of gender. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. The general checked his watch. I have a helicopter leaving for Nellis Air Force Base in 30 minutes. From there, you can catch a military transport back to Fort Bragg. Unless you'd prefer to finish the reception. Morgan glanced back at the gathering where Winters was watching them with barely concealed suspicion. I'm ready to leave now, sir. I thought you might be. The general handed her a folder. Your new order's already processed. And one more thing. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal the gold oak leaf insignia of a master sergeant. Technically, there should be a ceremony, but under the circumstances. Thank you, sir, Morgan said, accepting the insignia with a sense of disbelief. As they walked toward the waiting helicopter, General Hayden added, Oh, and I've arranged for Sergeant Major Harrison to be transferred to Fort Bragg once he's medically cleared. He mentioned something about having a few more lessons to teach before he fully retires. For the first time in days, Morgan felt a genuine smile spread across her face. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Harrison lay propped up against pillows, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Morgan had ever seen him, yet his eyes were as sharp as ever when she entered. About damn time, he grumbled. Was beginning to think you'd forgotten about an old man. Just got back to the States last night, Sarge, Morgan replied, taking a seat beside his bed. How are you feeling? Like I've been kicked by a mule. Doctors say I had a cardiac event. Fancy way of saying my ticker nearly gave out. He studied her face. But enough about me. Word is you won the whole damn competition and made a center mass hit at 3,500 meters to do it. Morgan nodded. Had some help from your training. Harrison waved away the credit. Bull. That was all you, Morgan. I just showed you the door. You walked through it all on your own. His expression softened slightly. Your old man would have been proud as hell. I know, Morgan said quietly. So what happens now? Back to picking up brass at Fort Bragg. Morgan couldn't suppress a smile as she reached into her pocket and withdrew her new insignia. Not exactly. Harrison's eyes widened as he recognized the Master Sergeant rank. Well, I'll be damned. General Hayden from SOCOM attended the final day, Morgan explained. He's appointed me a director of a new advanced sniper training program at Fort Bragg. Harrison let out a low whistle. Director, that's a hell of a jump, Morgan. There's more. He's arranged for you to join the program as a consultant once you're medically cleared. Said something about you having a few more lessons to teach. For a moment, Harrison seemed at a loss for words, an unusual state for the normally gruff veteran. Guess I'd better hurry up and get out of this hospital bed then, he finally said, his voice rougher than usual. Can't have you teaching those kids all wrong. Morgan smiled, recognizing the emotion behind his brusque manner. Program starts in 6 weeks. First class includes 18 men and 2 women best candidates from across all branches. Women, huh? Harrison raised an eyebrow. You're doing... I made it a condition, Morgan confirmed. If we're looking for the best snipers, we need to consider all candidates regardless of gender. Harrison nodded slowly. Winters must be spitting nails. Wouldn't know. Haven't heard from him since I left Utah. Morgan leaned back in her chair. Though Captain Hayes mentioned he's been reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon. Apparently some irregularities in the competition came to light. A satisfied smile spread across Harrison's weathered face. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg training ranges as Master Sergeant Alexis Morgan walked toward the assembled group of trainees. 20 soldiers, 18 men and 2 women stood at attention representing the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. They had been selected from hundreds of applicants as the first class of the Advanced Sniper Training Program. Morgan moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found her place. The past months had been a whirlwind of curriculum development, facility preparation, and personnel selection. She had insisted on building the program from the ground up, incorporating lessons from her own combat experience while challenging outdated doctrines. At ease, she commanded, surveying the group. Each trainee had already proven themselves exceptional, having passed rigorous selection criteria to reach this point. Welcome to the Advanced Sniper Training Program, Morgan began. Over the next 12 weeks, you will be pushed beyond any limits you thought you had. Some of you won't make it. Those who do will join the ranks of the most elite precision marksmen in the United States military. She paced slowly before them, making eye contact with each trainee. Sniper School has traditionally focused on technical skills, marksmanship, fieldcraft, ballistics. We'll cover all of that, of course. But this program goes further. Here, you'll learn to think like a sniper, to make impossible calculations in your head while under extreme stress, to trust your instincts when technology fails. Morgan gestured toward the firing line where various rifles were arranged. Look at those weapons. M24s, M110s, MK13s, Barrett M107s, some of the finest sniper systems ever developed. But make no mistake, they are just tools. The most sophisticated rifle in the world is useless without the right person behind it. She paused, letting the words sink in. Precision shooting isn't about the rifle, the scope, or the technology. It's about discipline, preparation, and the mental fortitude to perform under pressure. Some of you may have natural talent. Some of you may have the best equipment. But those who succeed will be those who never stop learning and never give up when things get difficult. Morgan noticed one of the female trainees in the front row hanging on every word. Private First Class Sarah Chun, whose file indicated exceptional scores in basic training but limited real-world experience. Something about the young soldier reminded Morgan of herself at that age, eager, determined, and probably carrying the weight of having to prove herself in a male-dominated field. As the trainees began their first day of assessments, Morgan moved among them, offering corrections and encouragement. At the far end of the line, she found Private Chun struggling with a complex wind calculation. "Having trouble, Private?" Morgan asked. "Yes, Master Sergeant," Chun admitted. "I'm trying to account for the wind shifts at different distances, but I keep second-guessing myself." Morgan knelt beside her. "What's your initial assessment?" "Wind at the firing line is 6 km from the southwest, but it looks like it's shifting more westerly downrange, probably increasing to 8 to 10 km. "Good observation. So what's the hesitation?" Chun looked uncomfortable. "My previous instructor emphasized using the ballistic calculator for anything beyond basic adjustments. Said trying to do complex calculations manually was outdated." Morgan nodded. "Those tools have their place, but what happens when the battery dies, or the system malfunctions, or you're using unfamiliar equipment? In those moments, it's not the technology that will save you. It's your training, your instincts, your ability to adapt." Chun considered this, then nodded with new determination. "I understand, Master Sergeant." As the training day progressed, Morgan found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The injury that had seemed like the end of her career had actually opened doors she'd never imagined. The humiliation of collecting shell casings had led to an opportunity to prove herself on a world stage. During the lunch break, she received a message that a visitor was waiting at the administration building. To her surprise, she found Captain Hayes, now Major Hayes, waiting in the reception area. "Major," Morgan greeted her with genuine pleasure. "This is unexpected." "I was at SOCOM headquarters for a briefing and thought I'd stop by," Hayes explained. "See how the program is developing." As they walked the grounds, Hayes updated Morgan on recent developments. "Winters is still at the Pentagon, thoroughly miserable, pushing papers. Davis washed out of Delta Force after an incident during training. Apparently his temperament wasn't suited for team operations." And you?" Morgan asked. "Promoted and reassigned to SOCOM's Special Projects Division. Still fighting the good fight, just from a different angle." Hayes paused, gazing out at the training ranges where Morgan's students were now practicing positional shooting. "You've built something impressive here, Morgan. In just 6 months, this program has already gained a reputation." "We have good people," Morgan replied modestly. "You have good leadership," Hayes corrected. "Don't underestimate what you've accomplished. This program is changing perceptions across the special operations community." As Hayes departed, Morgan returned to the range where Harrison, now officially the program's senior technical advisor, was demonstrating advanced rifle maintenance to a group of trainees. "How are they looking?" she asked quietly, joining him as the soldiers disassembled their weapons. "Better than I expected," Harrison admitted. "Especially that Chun. She reminds me of someone I used to know, too stubborn to quit, too smart to fail." Morgan smiled. "I have no idea who you're talking about." Harrison chuckled, then grew more serious. "You know, when I first took you under my wing all those years ago, I never imagined this. You've surpassed everything I taught you, Morgan." "Not everything, Sarge," Morgan replied softly. "I still remember the most important lesson. It's not the arrow, it's the Indian." Harrison nodded his eyes, reflecting pride he rarely expressed in words. "Damn straight." As the afternoon session concluded, Private Chun approached Morgan hesitantly. "Master Sergeant, may I ask you something?" "Go ahead, Private." "Is it true you're the one who made that 500-meter shot at the International Special Operations Competition last year?" Morgan studied the young soldier, seeing in her the same hunger for validation, the same determination to prove herself that had driven Morgan throughout her career. "The real question isn't what I did, Private," she replied. "It's what you'll do when your moment comes." Chun considered this, then straightened with renewed purpose. "I won't let you down, Master Sergeant." "It's not about letting me down," Morgan corrected gently. "It's about living up to your own potential. That's the only standard that truly matters." As the trainees departed for the day, Morgan and Harrison walked along the now quiet firing line. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the spent brass casings that littered the ground remnants of the day's training. "Never thought I'd live to see this day," Harrison mused. "When the best are chosen based on skill, not gender." "We've still got a long way to go, Sarge," Morgan replied, "but at least now they can't say we don't belong here." They began collecting the brass casings, a task that once symbolized Morgan's fall from grace, but now represented something entirely different. Morgan picked up a single casing, examining it in the fading light. "Every casing is an opportunity," she said thoughtfully. "A chance to prove where you belong." Harrison smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "And you never missed your opportunity, Morgan. Not once." As the last light faded from the sky, Master Sergeant Alexis Morgan looked out over the training ranges that were now her domain. 6 months ago, she had been collecting other people's shell casings, wondering if her career was over. Now she was shaping the future of American military marksmanship, passing on skills and knowledge that could save lives in future conflicts. It wasn't the path she had expected, but it was exactly where she belonged. And tomorrow, she would continue building something that would outlast her, a legacy of excellence that recognized talent wherever it was found, a program that would train the next generation of elite marksmen regardless of gender or background. For every woman who had been told she couldn't, for every soldier who had been underestimated, for every person who had faced seemingly insurmountable odds, Morgan had proved what was possible, one shot at a time.